Gary Sinise is one of those rare Hollywood figures who managed to win both critical acclaim and the deep respect of everyday Americans. For many, he will forever be remembered as Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump, a role that earned him an Academy Award nomination and turned him into a household name. But beyond the silver screen, Sinise carved out a second, equally remarkable identity, that of a tireless advocate for America's veterans. Through his Gary Sinise Foundation, he built homes for wounded soldiers, funded mental health programs, and gave his heart to those who served. But behind the applause and humanitarian image lies a life marked by personal struggles, heartbreak, and unimaginable loss. At 70, Gary Sinise's journey is far from the glitz of Hollywood. He's faced crushing family tragedies, the relentless burden of service, and the emotional toll of carrying other people's pain. His story is not just one of fame, but of resilience, in the face of sorrow. What many fans don't know is that Sinise's life has been shaped as much by grief as by glory. From career sacrifices to personal heartbreaks that nearly broke him, his path has been filled with challenges that even the strongest among us would struggle to bear. This is the untold story of Gary Sinise, the triumphs, the tragedies, and why his journey at 70 is beyond heartbreaking. Before Gary Sinise became a beloved figure in Hollywood, he was just a young man from Blue Island, Illinois, trying to find his place in the world. Born in 1955, Sinise grew up in a working-class family, and like many restless kids, wasn't sure where life would take him. But what he lacked in direction, he made up for with creativity and drive. In high school, he discovered acting almost by accident when he took part in a school play. That spark would change his life forever. In 1974, when most of his peers were still trying to figure out their careers, Sinise co-founded the Steppenwolf Theater Company in Chicago with his friends Terry Kinney and Jeff Perry. What started as a small, ambitious group of young actors turned into one of the most influential theater companies in the United States. Sinise was not just an actor, but also a director, shaping productions that would go on to define Chicago's reputation as a theater powerhouse. Through Steppenwolf, Sinise worked with some of the biggest names of the future: John Malkovich, Laurie Metcalf, Joan Allen, actors who, like him, would eventually make their way to Hollywood. His productions of True West and of Mice and Men caught national attention and showed his ability to bring raw, authentic performances to life. He wasn't chasing fame. He was building a foundation of respect and artistry. Hollywood eventually came calling, and Sinise slowly transitioned to film and television. His early film roles in the late 1980s and early 1990s didn't make him a star overnight, but they showcased his depth and range. He had a unique ability to play both heroes and deeply flawed characters with equal conviction, whether portraying George Milton in Of Mice and Men, 1992, or Ken Mattingly in Apollo 13, 1995. Sinise brought an authenticity that audiences and critics admired, but the role that changed his life forever was, of course, Lieutenant Dan Taylor in Forrest Gump, 1994. As the bitter, broken Vietnam veteran who loses his legs and spirals into despair before finding redemption, Sinise delivered a performance that resonated with millions. The role earned him an Academy Award nomination and introduced him to a cause that would shape the rest of his life: supporting veterans. Playing Lieutenant Dan wasn't just a job, it became a calling. Despite his growing fame, Sinise never let go of his theater roots. He continued to support Steppenwolf and other theater projects, reminding the world that he was more than just a Hollywood actor. He was an artist who cared deeply about the craft. Yet, even as his career flourished, tragedy and hardship loomed in the background. Fame brought recognition, but it also brought pressure and personal sacrifices. While the world celebrated his performances, few understood the struggles and losses that would soon define him as much as his art. Gary Sinise's rise from a small town, kid to an Oscar-nominated actor was inspiring, but it was only the beginning of a journey marked not just by triumphs, but by heartache that would test him in ways no role ever could. For most actors, landing a role in a film like Forrest Gump would be the pinnacle of their careers. For Gary Sinise, his portrayal of Lieutenant Dan wasn't just a breakthrough performance, it was life-changing. The film exploded into a cultural phenomenon in 1994, earning multiple Academy Awards and cementing itself as one of the greatest movies ever made. Sinise's role stood out not just because of his skill, but because of the humanity he brought to a wounded veteran's story. Lieutenant Dan was angry, broken, and lost, a man who felt abandoned by the country he served. But through his journey, audiences saw resilience, redemption, and hope. Sinise's ability to channel that pain struck a chord, especially with real veterans. They saw themselves in him, and many wrote to tell him that his performance gave them a sense of dignity they had long been denied. Suddenly, Sinise was more than an actor. He had become a symbol. But with fame came its price. Hollywood now expected him to match that performance, and every role afterward was measured against Lieutenant Dan. Sinise continued to deliver powerful work in films like Apollo 13, 1995, where he portrayed astronaut Ken Mattingly, with quiet intensity, and Ransom, 1996, where he stunned audiences as a villain. But the shadow of Forrest Gump was always there, and it wasn't easy living up to the impossible expectations. Television brought him a new chapter with CSI, NY, 2004-2013, where Sinise starred as Detective Mac Taylor. The series gave him stability, but it also chained him to long filming schedules that pulled him away from family and personal passions. While the show was successful, Sinise often admitted that the grind of network television left him exhausted. Fame and steady paychecks couldn't erase the growing toll on his personal life. And then there was the emotional burden of being tied so closely to the image of Lieutenant Dan. Veterans across the country embraced him, and Sinise welcomed that connection, but it came with a heavy responsibility. He spent countless hours visiting VA hospitals, attending military funerals, and lending his name to veteran causes. While this became his life's mission, it also meant absorbing the grief, trauma, and heartbreak of those who served. Carrying that weight was both an honor and a burden. At times, the work left him drained. Friends said Sinise often internalized the pain of the stories he heard, and while he rarely spoke publicly about his struggles, those closest to him saw the toll it took. It wasn't just about Hollywood anymore. It was about lives shattered by war and a man trying to shoulder more than one heart could reasonably bear. Still, Sinise pressed on. He understood that his platform was bigger than himself, and he was determined to use it for good. But the dual life, Hollywood star on one side, advocate and comforter on the other, came with sacrifices that few outsiders ever saw. Behind the smiling photos and standing ovations was a man who was quietly carrying the tragedies of others while dealing with his own. As Gary Sinise's career soared, so too did the personal challenges that would eventually come to define his life. Fame gave him recognition, but it also laid the foundation for heartbreaks that no award could ever heal. As Gary Sinise's career flourished, his life away from the spotlight was marked by heartbreaking struggles. Fame had given him recognition, but it did not shield him from the tragedies that would shape his personal story. In fact, his connection to Lieutenant Dan and to America's veterans soon intertwined with his own family's battles, making the burden of service deeply personal. One of the hardest blows came in 2018, when Sinise's son, McKenna Anthony Mac Sinise, was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer known as chordoma, a spinal tumor that affects only about 300 people in the United States each year. For a father who had devoted his life to helping others through pain, nothing could prepare Gary for watching his own child fight such a devastating disease. Mac was a gifted musician and composer, following in his father's artistic footsteps. But his illness forced him into a world of surgeries, treatments, and constant battles with pain. Gary devoted himself to being by his son's side while still maintaining his foundation work and public commitments. The dual responsibility nearly broke him, caring for his family while carrying the burdens of countless wounded veterans. In interviews, Gary admitted that faith and community were the only things that helped him survive those years. Tragically, Mac passed away in January 2024 at just 33 years old, leaving Gary and his family shattered. This wasn't the only personal tragedy Sinise faced. His wife, Moira Harris, whom he married in 1981, also endured serious health struggles, including multiple sclerosis. Supporting her through the ups and downs of the disease while raising 3 children placed enormous strain on the family. But Gary never wavered. He stood by Moira's side, often crediting her as his anchor and source of strength. Still, the toll of watching a loved one suffer added another layer to his quiet heartbreak. At the same time, his role as a champion for veterans exposed him to unimaginable grief. Through his Gary Sinise Foundation, he built smart homes for severely wounded soldiers, hosted morale-boosting concerts with his Lithian Dan Band, and personally visited military hospitals. But every handshake and every hospital bed meant absorbing stories of pain, trauma, and loss. He was often present at funerals for fallen soldiers, delivering comfort to grieving families while privately carrying their sorrow. Friends of Sinise have said that he often returned home emotionally drained, struggling under the weight of all the grief he witnessed. Though he rarely spoke publicly about the toll it took, those who knew him best said it was impossible for him not to internalize the heartbreak of others. In a way, he became a mirror of his most famous role, forever tied to Lieutenant Dan, a man broken by war, yet trying desperately to find hope in the darkness. By the time he reached his late 60s, Gary Sinise had endured the kind of personal tragedies that few could survive with grace. He lost his beloved son, cared for his ailing wife, and carried the grief of countless families who had lost their heroes. Yet through it all he kept going, choosing to serve others, even as he bore his own private pain. Turning 70 is often seen as a milestone, a chance to look back on a lifetime of achievements and prepare for a slower pace of life. For Gary Sinise, however, reaching this age is bittersweet. His journey has been filled with triumphs, but also devastating heartbreaks that continue to shape his legacy. Despite personal loss, Sinise has never stopped giving. His Gary Sinise Foundation has grown into one of the most respected nonprofit organizations supporting veterans and first responders. From building specially adapted homes for wounded heroes, to funding mental health programs, to hosting family support events, his work has changed thousands of lives. Veterans often say that Sinise gives them something Hollywood rarely offers: genuine compassion and consistent commitment. Even in his darkest moments, Sinise has turned his pain into purpose. After losing his son, Mac, in 2024, he honored him by sharing his music with the world, ensuring his creative spirit lives on. Rather than retreat into grief, Sinise used the tragedy to amplify his message of resilience, faith, and the power of community. He reminded people that while heartbreak is inevitable, how we respond defines who we are. At 70, his legacy isn't just about Forrest Gump or Apollo 13, though those roles remain iconic. It's about the man who stood up when others stayed silent. The actor who used fame not for self-indulgence but for service. In an industry known for egos, scandals, and selfishness, Sinise carved a different path, one built on sacrifice, empathy, and hope. Still, the tragedy of Gary Sinise is undeniable. The loss of his son, the years of watching his wife battle illness, and the emotional toll of carrying the pain of countless veterans have left scars that fame could never heal. At times, it seems almost unfair that one man has had to endure so much sorrow. Yet perhaps that is why Sinise resonates so deeply with millions, because his story reflects the human struggle to keep moving forward even when life feels unbearable. As he steps into his 70s, Sinise continues to perform with the L'Tendon band, visit military hospitals, and speak about the importance of faith and resilience. He could have chosen a quiet retirement, but instead, he keeps serving, determined to make every moment count. His tragedy is real, but so is his triumph. Gary Sinise's story reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there can be light. At 70, his life is a testament to endurance, compassion, and the idea that true greatness isn't found in awards or fame. It's found in how much of yourself you give to others. And while his journey has been heartbreaking, it has also been inspiring. For those who admire him, Gary Sinise will forever be more than an actor. He is a symbol of hope, a man who turned tragedy into a legacy of love and service.